The wind at Lobo Crossing carried no warmth that winter morning, only the bite of frost that clung to the earth like it meant to stay. Skies stretched pale and flat above the trading yard, as though the sun had lost all interest in giving comfort. The wagons had already rolled out, their loads heavy with grain and supplies, their coin purses emptied into the hands of men who measured worth by weight. The stock pens, once noisy with frightened breath and shifting bodies, now stood mostly silent, all but one. And before we go further, friend, if these true-hearted stories of the frontier stir something in you, if you want to hear more of the lives carved from dust, loss, and unlikely grace, make sure you like this video, leave a comment down below about where you're watching from, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Your voice keeps these old fires burning, and your presence means the story carries farther than one set of boots on a lonesome trail. Now, back to the yard, back to the frost, back to the pen. She sat alone in that last corner, knees pulled tight, bare feet tucked under like she could shield herself from the cold stone of the world. Her long hair hung loose, veiling a face streaked with dried blood and bruises. Rawhide bound her wrists so tight the cuts had already opened, and her deerskin dress hung torn across her shoulder. Every mark on her skin told a story of being dragged, beaten, handled, yet not broken. She hadn't begged, hadn't cried, hadn't bent her head in surrender, even bound, even left behind. Her chin stayed high, her gaze steady. That defiance alone set her apart from all the others who had been carted away. The men who had tried her patience, if not her spirit, spoke of her with scorn. One muttered about her teeth drawing blood. Another cursed the spit she had flung at his face. A third called her worthless for not kneeling, as though worth could be measured by obedience. And so she was left there, too wild, they said, too much trouble. She was the one nobody bought, the one cast aside. To them, she was refuse. To herself, she was still unbroken. Inside, beneath the cuts and bruises, she held to the last thing that had not been taken from her, the choice not to bow. And there by the feed shed stood Gideon Cain, a tall man with the bearing of old service, his shoulders still carrying the memory of a cavalry coat, though he hadn't worn one in years. His scarf was frayed, his gloves patched, and his hat carried snow dust across the brim. 5 winters past, he had buried his wife and son in the frozen earth behind his ranch, and with them, he buried speech to God and tenderness to man. Since then, he had walked in silence, a widower's frame, hardened by work, a scar burning his forearm. Each winter, like an old brand, he had learned to ignore. He hadn't come for women, he never did. He came for grain, straps, a hinge, yet his eyes stayed on her. Not with pity, he had none left to spend. Not with lust, he'd seen that in other men's faces and turned from it. It was something quieter, sharper, maybe the way her stare mirrored his own, cornered, alone, still standing. Maybe he saw the same defiance in her that he carried each time he lifted his head to a world that had already taken what it could. When his boots carried him to the pen, the trader looked up in surprise. "Not that one," the man said, ledger in hand, his tone half a laugh. "She ain't housebroken. Damn near took Ned's finger this morning, but Gideon didn't answer." He set 2 silver coins on the rail, his eyes never leaving hers. The trader scoffed, quick to snatch the money. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The raw hide was cut, the gate swung open. She did not lunge, did not flinch. She stood slow from the stiffness, her body trembling from the cold, but her gaze fixed, unyielding. Gideon extended a hand, plain, unadorned, no trick. She did not take it. She rose on her own and walked past him. And in that moment, though no word passed between them, a truth settled. She would not be bought into submission, and he would not demand it. The ride out was quiet. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket he tossed her way, eyes set backward on the trail, mapping the land for escape. He did not look back, his thoughts straying instead to the ridge, to the 2 stones that watched his house from the hill, to the lives that had left him hollow. He did not know if she would run. Perhaps part of him expected it. Perhaps part of him hoped she wouldn't. By nightfall she had tried, scraped her legs raw in the dark, and returned. Not because she was conquered, but because survival chose the warmer fire. Gideon had not barred the door. He had not chained her hands. He simply waited. And when her steps returned, faint but steady, he felt the strange weight of relief, though he would not name it. That was the first night. She lay curled on the floor by the hearth, close enough to feel the heat, not yet daring the cot he left open. Gideon worked the morning chores as though nothing had changed, though everything had. She remained through the day. He set water for her to wash. She swept his floor. Neither thanked, neither asked, but the beginning had been made, and so their story took root, not from mercy, not from ownership, but from the narrowest crack in the frost, where 2 people, long pressed grief and cruelty, found the shape of survival in each other's silence. The frost had not lifted by the second morning, and neither had the silence that stretched between them. Yet it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the kind that marked the edge of something unspoken, waiting. Gideon Cain, who had lived with nothing but the creak of boards and the bark of his dog for half a decade, felt the change like a shift in weather, subtle but certain. She was still cautious, still coiled like a wire ready to spring, but she had come back to the fire instead of vanishing into the snow. That choice lingered in his mind more than the sound of her bare feet on the porch. And though he would never say it aloud, part of him felt steadier for it, as though the cabin no longer carried only his shadow. He watched her closely those first days, not with suspicion, but with the steady patience of a man who had learned the cost of haste. She ate what he set before her without complaint, her shoulders tense as though bracing for a strike that never came. When she swept the hearth or hammered a loose nail back into the floorboard, her movements were deliberate, meant to test the ground as much as to mend it. Gideon noticed every detail, the way she glanced at the door before turning her back, the way her fingers lingered over splinters, as though measuring escape routes. She had survived on instinct, and instinct did not fade in a night. He understood. He, too, lived each day as if ambush were possible at any moment. Not from raiders or soldiers now, but from memory. And memory was the cruelest ambush of all. He had buried his wife and his boy with his own hands on a ridge of frozen dirt that did not want to yield. The soil had fought him, as though refusing to take them, but Gideon had forced it, driven the spade until the earth gave way. He had not spoken since, not to God, not to neighbors, not to himself in the quiet hours. Words had dried up in him, brittle and useless, replaced by labor and silence. Now, sitting by the fire while the Apache woman, Tiva, though he did not yet know her name, curled into the wool blanket, he felt the stir of words again. Not spoken, not formed, but there, like water beneath ice. She was a mirror to his own loss, though she had been marked by different hands. The rawhide cuts on her wrists, The bruises along her collarbone, the scarred ankle where she had been dragged, they told a story of cruelty, of men who measured value in obedience and pain. Yet beneath it all, she held herself with a pride he recognized. Her chin stayed high even when her shoulders sagged from exhaustion. Her eyes did not drop even when her body bent toward the fire in need. Gideon found himself studying that pride, not out of curiosity, but because it reminded him of the way he had once stood after the war. Scar burning, boots unsteady, but refusing to bow to pity or to God. He had not come to town seeking her. He had not planned to spend silver on anything but leather straps and a hinge for the barn door. Yet here she was, sitting by his fire and breathing steady in his cabin, and his life was no longer what it had been the day before. The second evening, when the wind howled sharp and the shutters rattled, she sat straighter, not crouched. She did not ask for warmth. She simply pulled the blanket tighter and watched him work by lamplight. When he set bread on the table, she crossed the floor and ate beside him, not behind, not waiting. He noticed the way her hands shook less, the way her eyes searched less often for exits. He noticed, too, the way she studied him, as if weighing what kind of man he might be, not cruel, not merciful, something in between, something harder to name. It was on the third day that she pointed toward the ridge behind the barn. "Graves?" she asked, her voice rough from long silence. Gideon nodded. "My wife, my boy." She said nothing more, did not ask for their names, did not speak comfort. She only stood by the window a while longer, watching the slope until the cold drove her back to the fire. He respected her for that. No wasted pity, no false words, only presence. That night he left a folded dress on the chair beside her cot. He did not wait to see if she would wear it. By dawn, she had. It fit loosely, draped across shoulders still bearing bruises, but the sight of her tending the stove in it struck Gideon with a quiet force. She was not the woman in the torn deer hide anymore, not the figure crouched in a pen while men laughed. She was something else now, something beginning. When she caught him looking, she turned away quickly, tugging at the fabric with nervous hands. He looked away, too, not out of shame, but because he would not be the kind of man who turned her gaze into a weight. He had seen enough of that in town. Still, the cabin felt different with her standing in that dress. Warmer, fuller, less like a tomb, and more like a place meant for the living. And though Gideon Cain did not speak it, though she did not whisper it, both of them knew the truth. The choice she had made to come back to the fire, to stay when she might have fled, had already altered the course of both their lives. The cabin no longer echoed with one man's silence. It now carried two silences, side by side, and between them lay the faint but steady shape of trust. Snow had a way of muting the world, of pressing everything down until sound itself seemed afraid to stir. By the fourth morning, the cabin felt sealed in wool, quiet and tight against the storm that had rolled down from the ridge. Gideon Cain rose before dawn as always, feeding the stove, pulling on patched gloves, his breath steaming in the lantern glow. Across the room, she stirred on the cot, no longer curled like a trapped animal, but stretched, her arm flung across the wool blanket. When her eyes opened, they did not dart toward the door. They found him, steady and held. That small shift carried the weight of 100 words. Neither spoke. The days had begun to fold into a rhythm, and rhythm is where trust often hides. He laid food near the hearth without asking, and she ate. He chopped wood, and she swept ash. He mended tack in the barn. and she stitched saddlecloth with uneven thread but steady hand. These were not bargains struck. They were exchanges of breath and labor, each act carrying the shape of survival made easier together. Yet it was not survival alone that Gideon noticed. It was the way her silences changed. The first night, her silence had been brittle, ready to shatter at the scrape of a chair. Now it was heavy, rooted, carrying its own dignity. She no longer looked like a woman crouched to endure. She looked like one choosing to remain. That distinction mattered more to him than any word could, for he too lived in silence, but his was the silence of loss. To share it with another and not feel it pressing him into the ground, that was something he had not known in years. It was near dusk when the turning point came. He had returned from the barn, coat damp with snow, arms laden with kindling. She stood near the window staring out at the ridge. The snow came sideways, whipping against the glass, but her eyes were fixed on the faint outline of the cottonwood beyond. She did not turn when he set the wood down. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed, a simple motion but with weight behind it. "Graves?" she asked again, voice rough as stones. He nodded, his own throat tight. "My wife, my boy." She didn't answer, didn't ask names, just stood there, still as the frost, and let the truth hang between them. It was the first time in years Gideon had spoken their presence aloud. And somehow, hearing it in his own voice did not reopen the wound. It settled it. That night, he left a folded wool dress on the chair by her cot, not new, not fine, but sturdy, clean, a thing that might give her back some measure of dignity. He set it down without word, as one might leave water for a weary traveler. By morning she wore it, tending the stove with her back to him, shoulders no longer cloaked in torn deer hide. It fit loose, but to Gideon it was as though the cabin itself had shifted. She was not a prisoner in rawhide anymore. She was a woman choosing to stand in his house. When she caught him watching, her hands tugged the fabric nervously and she turned aside. Gideon looked away as well, not out of discomfort, but because he knew what it meant to be stared at the wrong way. He would not be that man. Peak, yet in the quiet, something unspoken stretched between them, an understanding that the cabin was no longer only his. The third evening sealed it. They sat across from each other, stew between them, the fire spitting sparks in the grate. She hesitated before lifting her spoon, as though surprised to be served at the same table. Halfway through the meal, she set it down, eyes steady on him. "Why me?" she asked. Gideon did not answer right away. He chewed, swallowed, then shrugged. "You didn't beg," he said simply. She held his gaze a moment longer, then looked down, her lips pressed tight. She did not smile. She did not speak again. But she finished the food, and when she rose for bed, she did so without flinching as he passed. That small act carried more weight than any oath. Later, when the fire had burned low, Gideon sat near the stove, polishing a blade, the silence wrapping him as it always had. But it was not the old silence anymore. It no longer echoed with grief alone. It carried her breathing, steady and near, the sound of another soul at rest. He realized, sitting there, that he was not merely hosting her survival, he was sharing his own. The storm raged outside, snow piling against the cabin walls, muting the valley to nothing. Inside, warmth held steady. She curled on the cot, wrapped in wool, her dark hair falling across her face. Gideon leaned back, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the fire until it hissed. He thought of the graves on the ridge, of the way her voice had sounded when she asked, and of how she had not pitied him for the answer. His chest tightened, but not with grief, with something he could not yet name. He did not sleep easily that night, but when he did, it was not the restless slumber of a man alone in a tomb of memory. It was lighter, steadier, as though the presence of her breath in the room kept the shadows at bay. And when he woke before dawn, the first thing he saw was not absence, but her form curled by the fire, her hand resting calm against the wool. By then, Gideon Cain knew one thing with quiet certainty. She was no longer the woman left behind in the stock pen, and he was no longer the man who came to town only for grain and hinges. Something had begun between them. Not spoken, not bound, but chosen in silence. And on the frontier, where loss outnumbered promise, that choice was worth more than silver. The storm broke by morning, though the sky still sagged low and heavy, as if uncertain whether to lift its weight from the valley. Snow lay deep against the porch, softening every edge of the world, muting the sound of hoof and wind alike. Gideon Cain stepped out into the white silence with his dog trailing close, boots cracking the crust of ice as he crossed to the barn. Behind him, he heard the door shift, faint but sure. When he glanced back, she was there, no longer cloaked in torn deer hide, no longer crouched in corners, but standing in the doorway. In the wool dress he'd left for her, the blanket wrapped over her shoulders. She watched him work, her eyes steady. When he returned with the buckets, she had swept the hearth and stoked the fire. He said nothing, but he noticed. And in the noticing, he felt the cabin's silence bend again, reshaped by presence. The days turned into a pattern, the kind Gideon had long relied on to keep the grief at bay, feed the animals, split the wood, mend the tack, tend the stove. But now the pattern was no longer his alone. She moved through it beside him, not in step, not in command, but in rhythm. When he hauled water, she folded blankets. When he patched leather, she stitched coarse thread through torn saddlecloth. These were small acts, unremarkable to any passerby. But to Gideon, they were markers of something building. They were not bargains. They were not duties owed. They were survival made easier by two hands instead of one. Her silences deepened, but not with fear. They grew steady, weighted with intent. When she swept the floor, she did it, not as someone proving her worth, but as one claiming space. When she sat by the fire, she no longer curled inward. She leaned back, shoulders loose, as though for the first time in months, she could let her bones rest. Gideon saw it. He felt it in the marrow of the house. This was no longer just his silence. It was theirs, and it no longer hollowed him out. It filled him. On the third evening, something shifted. She lingered by the window as the last of the snow blew past the ridge. Gideon stood beside her, close enough to hear the soft cadence of her breath. She lifted her hand, pointed toward the cottonwood, and asked again, "Graves?" He nodded once, jaw tight. "My wife, my boy." She did not turn to him, did not offer comfort. She let the words rest in the air like stones laid on the earth. He found himself grateful for that, for her refusal to cheapen his loss with pity. When she stepped back, he felt the air ease, as though the wound had been acknowledged without being torn open. That night she lay down on the cot without flinching when he passed, and the silence in the room carried a weight that was no longer grief alone. By dawn, her presence had woven itself deeper into the fabric of the place. She rose earlier, tending to the stove before he returned from the barn. He watched her from the doorway, the hem of the wool dress brushing against her ankles as she bent to stir the coals. The light caught her hair, loose across her shoulder, and for a moment Gideon felt the sharp edge of memory. His wife once standing in that same spot, her laughter long vanished. But when the ache came, it did not hollow him. It settled, tempered by the sight of this woman who had chosen to return, who had chosen to stay. Later that day, while mending a harness at the workbench, he found her at his side, threading a needle through torn cloth. She did not ask. She simply began, her stitches clumsy but holding. Gideon did not correct her, did not comment. He let her work stand. For the first time since the burial on the ridge, he felt the weight of another set of hands carrying part of the load. That evening, stew simmered in the pot, thick with rabbit and potato. She hesitated before sitting at the table, as though waiting for permission. Gideon ladled 2 bowls, set them down without ceremony, and sat across from her. She ate in silence until halfway through, when her spoon stilled. Her eyes met his, dark and searching. "Why me?" she asked. He swallowed, shrugged, voice low. "You didn't beg." Her gaze lingered a moment longer, then she returned to her meal. She finished every bite. Gideon felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been bound since the day he set stones over his family's graves. That night, as the fire sank low, she did not wait for the last embers before lying down. She curled into the blanket, eyes closing with a steadiness he had not seen before. When Gideon passed to hang his coat, she did not tense. She simply turned her face to the wall and let herself sleep. He stood there longer than he meant to, watching the rise and fall of her breath. Then he sat by the stove, staring into the flames, and realized the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive. Outside, the snow pressed heavy against the valley, sealing them in. But inside, warmth spread, not just from the stove, but from the quiet companionship of 2 people who had endured loss and still chosen to remain. Gideon leaned back in his chair, listening to her breathing mingle with the crackle of the fire. He thought of the ridge, of the names he had not spoken aloud in years, and of the woman now under his roof who carried her scars with the same stubborn pride he carried his own. For the first time in 5 winters, Gideon Cain felt the silence around him as something other than grief. He felt it as presence, and presence on a land where so much was taken was its own kind of miracle. By the time the storm's grip began to ease, the cabin had changed shape, not in its timbers or stone, but in the way it carried 2 lives instead of 1. Gideon Cain, who had grown used to the steady weight of his own silence, found that it no longer pressed so hard when shared. And she, Tiva, though he had not yet spoken her name aloud, no longer sat curled like a hunted thing. She moved differently now, shoulders looser, her silences thicker with meaning rather than fear. It was in that air, with snow piled against the windows and the ridge standing quiet under its blanket of white, that her voice began to return in pieces. She spoke first by the fire, eyes low, hands curled around a cup Gideon had set before her. Her voice was gravel, worn from disuse, but it carried truth without flinching. She told him of the trades, one winter to another, hands exchanged as though she were nothing but coin. One man had beaten her, another had tied her for 3 days. The last had called her cursed for speaking back. She did not speak in detail, but she gave him fragments, enough to paint her life in lines of scar and bruise. Gideon sat across from her, quiet as stone, letting her words stand without judgment. He did not interrupt. He did not soften them. He simply listened. For her, that was new. For him, it was everything. When her jaw tightened and she said, "I would not kneel," he nodded once. "I know." Nothing more. No pity. No questions. Only recognition. The room carried the sound of the kettle and the crackle of fire, and in that silence lay respect. For the first time since the stock pens, she felt her defiance seen not as trouble but as strength. That evening, when the fire sank low, she did not keep her distance. She sat closer, her knees drawn under the blanket, her shoulders brushing the air near his chair. He did not reach for her. He did not move away. The quiet between them had shape now, not brittle but whole, a thing that said more than touch might. In the days that followed, their work fell into rhythm. Gideon split wood, and she carried it inside. She stirred the stew while he patched the roof beam. When her fingers bled from the needle mending his saddle blanket, he did not take the work from her. He set the tin of salve nearby, wordless, letting her finish her stitches before tending to the cuts. These small exchanges spoke of something deeper than survival. They spoke of partnership. Still, the past lingered in both of them. Gideon felt it each time he passed the ridge, each time his boots sank into the snow where his wife and boy lay. She felt it each time she caught her reflection in the tin basin, the faint line of scar across her collarbone. But instead of hiding those wounds, they began to show them quietly in the spaces where trust had taken root. He told her of Micah, 6 years old, lost to the bluff. He told her of the grave dug with frozen hands. She told him of a brother swept by the river, never found. The confessions were sparse, but they held weight, offered not as weakness, but as truths that no longer needed to be carried alone. On one evening, the kettle hissed and the fire spat sparks while snow battered the shutters. She turned to him, voice low but steady. "I stay because I am not afraid here." Gideon did not answer right away. He stared at the flames, the memory of years of silence pressing in. Then he nodded once. "That's enough." It was not a vow, not a promise, but it was the nearest thing either of them had spoken to naming what had grown between them. The storm kept them bound in the cabin for days more. And in that time, the silences became companionable. She sat near him while he polished his knife, repeating English words he offered: cup, chair, stove, door, her tongue wrapping clumsily around the sounds. She laughed once when she stumbled, and the sound startled them both. Gideon found himself watching her mouth form the syllables, feeling something stir inside that had been buried under grief too long. Not lust, though she was beautiful and he was not blind, but warmth, the first he had felt since the ridge took his family. When he asked if she wished to stay, she did not hesitate. "I stay because I choose," she said. The words struck Gideon like the clean edge of an axe against wood. Choice. That was the thing neither of them had been granted for too long. She was not kept. She was not bought. She was choosing. And he, a man who had chosen nothing but survival for 5 winters, found himself choosing too. Choosing to let her presence mean something. Choosing to let himself breathe. That night, when she touched her lips to his cheek before turning to the cot, Gideon sat by the dying fire longer than he needed to, feeling the warmth of that kiss burn steadier than the flames. He did not sleep easily, but when he did, it was not in emptiness. It was in the presence of another soul who had defied being broken. By the time the snow began to ease, when the valley stirred again with the groan of thawing ice and the cry of crows, they had settled into something unspoken but whole. They moved through the chores, not as strangers, but as a pair, each carrying the other's silence as if it were their own. Gideon no longer felt the house as a tomb. She no longer felt herself a prisoner in a pen. Both felt, in the marrow of their bones, that they had come through something together. And though no vows had been spoken, no promises written, both knew the truth. In the heart of winter, among frost and graves, something had taken root between them. Not survival alone, but trust. Not obligation, but choice. And choice in a land where everything else was taken was the beginning of freedom. When the valley began to thaw, the shape of their days shifted again. Snow pulled back from the ridge in slow retreat. Water ran heavy through the creek beds, and the ground softened under boots that had grown used to the bite of frost. Gideon Cain moved through these changes with the same steadiness he had carried for years. But now there was another pair of footsteps trailing behind him. Tiva no longer hovered at the edges of the cabin. She stepped beside him, sometimes a pace behind, sometimes ahead, but always there. And in that presence lay a truth neither of them had spoken outright. They were no longer two lives crossing by chance, but two lives bound by choice. The first morning the sun broke clear. Gideon handed her his smaller coat, sleeves too long but lined well, cinched at the waist with rawhide. She wore it without fuss, her braid falling low over the collar as they crossed the yard together. The old dog limped after them, tail up as if he too felt the shift. Inside the barn, Tiva Shah moved with growing confidence, measuring oats into buckets, brushing the mare's flank, checking the trough. Gideon leaned against the stall post, arms folded, and said quietly, "You've done this before." She glanced up, gave a small nod. "My mother's brother kept horses. That was all." She did not explain further, and he did not press. It was enough. Their rhythm deepened in those weeks. She swept the porch while he split logs. She carried buckets while he patched the roof. Once, she set the broom aside and walked over, eyeing the axe in his hands. "Can I try?" Gideon blinked, then held it out without a word. Her first swing landed crooked, the second better, the fourth clean and strong. She straightened, chest heaving, cheeks flushed, pride in her eyes. Gideon allowed himself the faintest of smiles, rare but real. She caught it, and for the first time, he saw her return it. That night, with the fire low, she stood near him by the stove, her hands brushing against his as he passed her a shawl. She did not flinch this time. She let the fabric fall across her shoulders and met his eyes. He did not speak, but neither did he step back. Something hung between them, quiet, unfinished, but steady. It was on a night not long after that she broke the silence with words that carried more weight than any oath. "Where's your family buried?" she asked. Gideon glanced toward the ridge. "Behind the barn, under the cottonwood." She nodded once. "You've lived here alone since?" His voice came low. 5 years. She studied him, her face lit by the fire. Then she spoke again, her voice rough, steady. "I was traded away 2 winters ago, twice since then. One man beat me, another tied me. They said I was cursed for fighting back." Gideon's hands stilled on the knife he was polishing. He did not look at her, did not interrupt. He let her words stand. She finished with the same defiance he had seen in her from the first. "They tied me to a post for 2 days last time, then brought me here to sell. But I would not kneel." He nodded once, meeting her eyes. "I know." The fire cracked, the kettle hissed, and the weight of her words settled into the room like stones pressed into earth. She had spoken her past without shame, and he had answered without judgment. For both, that was enough. The following day, their work carried a new ease. She passed tools to him without being asked. He read the slope of her shoulders and knew when she was sore. They did not speak of what had been said the night before, but it colored every glance, every motion. Trust had been given, not forced, and it became the quiet foundation of the house. That evening, she asked him to teach her words in English. They sat near the stove, his hand pointing to objects, hers repeating, cup, chair, door, fire. She stumbled, laughed once at her own mistake, and the sound startled them both. Gideon felt something stir in his chest, something softer than grief, warmer than silence. He asked if she wished to stay. Her answer came without hesitation. I stay because I choose, not because I am kept. He met her gaze and nodded. That's how it should be. Later, when she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, Gideon felt the weight of 5 winters shift. It was not a kiss of pity or obligation. It was choice, deliberate and steady. He sat long after she had gone to the cot, the fire low, his hand brushing the warmth left on his skin. For the first time since burying his wife and boy, Gideon Cain felt not just alive, but chosen. The thaw quickened in the days that followed. Snow melted into slush. Water ran through the creek, and birdsong returned to the valley. The rhythm of work remained, wood to chop, animals to tend, fences to mend. But the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full of words unspoken but understood, full of presence, full of choice. And as the earth softened underfoot, and the ridge stood clear against the sky, Gideon realized that what had begun as a purchase born of chance had become something else entirely. He had not bought obedience. He had not found a servant. He had found a woman who had chosen to stay. And in her choice, he found his own reason to rise each morning, his own reason to let silence mean something more than grief. The graves on the ridge remained, the past unaltered, the loss still sharp. But the cabin, once nothing but a shelter for a man and his ghosts, now carried warmth, breath, and the steady presence of another. And in that presence, Gideon Cain felt a truth settled deep. Survival shared is no longer survival alone. It is the beginning of life again. The thaw had loosened the valley, but inside the cabin, something else was loosening too. What had begun as silence shared for survival was shaping into something heavier, something that held warmth instead of emptiness. Gideon Cain knew the weight of silence better than any man alive. For 5 winters, it had been his only companion, and he had carried it like a stone across his chest. But now, when he sat by the stove and heard her breathing across the room, that same silence felt different, full, whole, a language without words. It was in that silence that trust deepened, in that silence that her voice returned in pieces, and in that silence that the unspoken question began to press on them both. What did it mean to stay, not just another night, but for good? The morning air was sharp, the ground wet with melt when Tiva asked for the axe again. She took to the woodpile, as though proving not to him, but to herself, that her strength was still her own. Gideon watched her swing, her stance firmer now, her shoulders carrying less fear and more certainty. She split a log clean through, breath steaming in the air. And for the first time in years, Gideon felt a faint smile crease his face without him willing it. She caught it, and instead of looking away as she once had, she let it linger between them like an ember that refused to die out. That night she stood close to him near the fire, the shawl draped over her shoulders. When his hand brushed hers, As he passed a mug, she did not flinch. She let it happen, even tilted her fingers just enough that the touch became deliberate. Gideon said nothing. He had never been a man of many words, and grief had stolen what few he once had. But his silence now was not avoidance. It was respect. He knew the meaning of her choice, that she allowed herself to be near him not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Later, when she asked him to show her more words, he sat with her by the fire. His hand pointed, her voice repeated, cup, door, chair, stove. When she stumbled, she laughed softly, a sound so rare it startled them both. Gideon found himself watching her mouth form the sounds, each syllable carrying the shape of defiance turned into life. For a man who had buried all warmth under the soil with his family, it was like feeling the first breath of spring after years of frost. It was after one of these evenings, when the fire had burned low, that she pressed her lips gently to his cheek. The touch was not long, not demanding, but it carried more weight than any kiss of hunger could. It was a gift. It's plain and unforced. Gideon sat there long after she had gone to her cot, his hand lifting once to the place where her lips had been. He did not close his eyes to grief that night. He closed them to remember the warmth of being chosen. The days turned toward routine again, yet now each small act carried meaning. She baked bread, and he found himself eating slower, watching the way her hands moved when she set the loaf on the table. He mended her boots with care, and she wore them without a word, her steps firmer in the snowmelt. She fixed the latch on the feed bin, and he let her work stand, uncorrected. They moved in a rhythm that was not commanded but chosen. It was during one such day, as he split logs and she swept the porch, that she crossed the yard and stood before him. "I thought you would want what others did," she said quietly, her eyes steady. Gideon paused, the axe haft in his hands. "That's not why I brought you here," he answered. She studied him, nodded once. "I know that now, but I didn't then." She turned back toward the cabin, her shoulders straighter than before, her steps firm. Gideon watched her go, the weight of her words settling in his chest like something long buried rising to the surface. That evening, when he handed her a shawl, her hands brushed his deliberately. She did not pull away. He did not either. Neither spoke of it, but both understood. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. By the time the thaw had given way to soft green in the hills, their lives had become stitched together by routine and trust. Gideon no longer imagined her leaving when he returned from town. She no longer traced the trail behind the wagon with her eyes as if measuring escape. Instead, she swept the hearth, stirred the stew, or stood waiting by the barn when he came back with mud on his boots. She had made her choice to stay clear. He had made his to let her. And though they had not spoken vows, though no ring or promise bound them, both knew the truth. Something had taken root in that cabin. It was not born of pity or ownership. It was not forced. It was chosen. And in a land where so much was taken by violence, by hunger, by grief, the act of choosing to remain was the greatest defiance of all. That night, as the fire burned low and Tiva lingered closer than she ever had before, Gideon felt her presence settle into him, the way warmth seeps into old stone. He reached out, not to claim, not to bind, but to rest his hand lightly against her wrist. She looked at him, her eyes unflinching, and in that glance lay everything they had not spoken. Respect, trust, The beginnings of something that could outlast even grief. Gideon Cain, once a man hollowed by silence, sat in that cabin knowing one truth. She had returned, she had stayed, and she had chosen. And in her choice, he found his own reason to rise each morning. The ridge behind the barn still held his dead, but the hearth before him now held life. Spring came slow to the valley, but it came. Snow shrank back from the cottonwoods, the creek broke loose of its ice, and the ground softened enough that boots no longer rang hollow against it. Gideon Cain had lived through many turnings of the season, most of them heavy with the same ache, but this one was different. This one carried the sound of another pair of footsteps in the yard, the sight of a shawl folded neatly on a chair that wasn't his, and the smell of bread baking in a hearth that had long gone unused for anything but stew. Tiva moved through the cabin not as a stranger surviving the night, but as a woman shaping her place with steady hands. And Gideon, though he never said it aloud, felt the change in his bones. For the first time in 5 winters, the air inside his house did not taste of absence. It tasted of presence. The rhythm of their days carried weight now, not just survival. He woke before dawn, stoked the stove, pulled on boots, and stepped out to the barn. She rose soon after, swept ashes from the hearth, folded her blanket, and set water to boil. Their chores met in the middle, wood stacked by the door, bread on the table, tools mended side by side at the workbench. The silence that had once been brittle now held shape, carrying comfort rather than fear. Gideon noticed how she no longer curled in corners or kept her back pressed to walls. She stood by windows, sat in chairs, moved freely about the cabin as though she belonged, because she did. One morning, while she braided her hair by the fire, Gideon paused, watching the motion of her hands. The braid was uneven, her fingers stiff from old scars, but there was a steadiness to it that struck him. He remembered the first night he saw her crouched in the pen, wrists bound and pride unbroken. Now she sat in his cabin, warm, fed, her gaze lifting to meet his without flinching. That transformation was not born of rescue alone. It was born of her choice to stay and his choice not to bind her. Gideon felt the truth of it settle in him like stone. They had begun something that could not be undone by silence. It was late in the thaw when she asked him again about the graves. They climbed the ridge together, boots sinking into wet earth, the cottonwood above them, just beginning to bud. Tiva stood before the stones, hands loose at her sides. "Your boy?" she asked softly. Gideon nodded. "Micah." She knelt, brushed her fingers across the cold stone. "I would have fed him." Told him stories. Gideon's throat tightened. He had not wept in 5 years, but her words struck through his silence like a blade. She did not pity. She simply offered herself into the gap where loss lived. When she rose, her eyes met his. "Do they rest easy now?" she asked. Gideon swallowed hard. "I think they would have liked you." On, and with that, something in him eased that he hadn't realized he was still carrying. That night he offered her a comb, small and worn, once belonging to his wife, hers. He did not speak as he handed it over, but she understood. She pressed it to her chest, then laid it beside her on the blanket, as though accepting it, but making it her own. Gideon watched her fingers brush stray strands of hair from her cheek, and the sight filled the cabin with a warmth he had thought lost forever. The days grew longer, their chores lighter with the lifting of winter. Tiva's laughter returned once more, small but clear, when Gideon stumbled over the Apache words she had asked him to learn. She leaned against the doorframe, braid over her shoulder, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. Gideon did not laugh back, but the faint warmth on his face was enough for her. It was in those weeks that closeness became something more. Not through words, not through grand gestures, but through presence. She touched his wrist when passing him a tool. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. When she bent too near the fire, neither spoke of it, but both knew. Their silences had become a bridge. One night, as the fire burned low, she did not go to the cot. She lingered by his chair, eyes steady, breath calm. Gideon lifted his gaze, met hers, and in that glance lay a question that needed no words. She leaned forward, pressed her lips to his, not hurried, not forced, but slow, deliberate, chosen. He did not pull her close, nor did he turn away. He let her choose the pace, the weight, the truth of it. When she drew back, her eyes held his, and he touched her wrist lightly, only long enough to tell her he was still there. From that night forward, she no longer slept alone. The cot stood empty, the blanket folded, her shawl hung beside his coat, her boots rested next to his by the door. The cabin was no longer his and hers, it was theirs. And in that truth, Gideon Cain felt something bloom in his chest he had not thought possible. Life after grief. The town whispered, as towns do, but neither of them cared. They had carved their space in the valley, among graves and thawing earth, and no man's word could undo what they had chosen. Gideon knew hardship still waited, storms, hunger, men who would call her savage, worthless. But when he looked at her across the table, shawl draped over her shoulders, pride in her gaze, he knew they could withstand it, for she had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let her. And so the season turned, and with it, their lives. The graves on the ridge stood where they always had, but now the cabin below carried laughter, warmth, and breath again. Gideon no longer lived in silence alone. He lived in silence shared, silence full, silence that had become the language of love. By the time the valley dressed itself in green, their days no longer carried the same desperate edge of survival. Gideon Cain had lived long enough to know that the frontier never promised peace for long, but spring carved out a softer season between storms, and he found himself watching the change, not only in the land, but in the woman who had chosen to remain. Tiva no longer moved as a guest or a fugitive. She moved as though the cabin had always been hers, her steps firm, her voice steadier when she practiced English words by the fire, her laughter surfacing now and again like water breaking through dry earth. Gideon, who had not thought himself capable of smiling again, found the lines of his face easing when she did. Their chores carried the rhythm of a shared life. In the mornings, he split logs while she swept the porch, her braid swinging over one shoulder, the broom catching the soft dust left by retreating snow. By midday, she stirred stew while he mended tack, the two of them working side by side at the table as if they had been born to the same labor. In the evenings, they sat near the fire. The dog sprawled between them, the silence whole rather than hollow. Gideon knew well the difference. He had lived years with silence that rang of loss, silence that pressed him deeper into his own grave. Now the silence between them bore weight, but also warmth. It was not emptiness, it was presence. It was in that presence that trust deepened into something more. Gideon felt it when her hand brushed his while passing a cup, and she did not draw away. He felt it when she laid her shawl beside his coat on the peg, as though declaring that her place was no longer temporary. He felt it most when she leaned against him one evening by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder as if it had always belonged there. Gideon did not move, did not speak, but inside him something shifted. A stone rolled from a place long sealed. For 5 winters he had carried grief like a weight that could not be lifted. Now he carried something else, the steady warmth of being chosen. The graves on the ridge did not vanish. He visited them still, boots sinking into thawed earth, eyes lingering on the stones he had stacked with frozen hands. But when Tiva came with him, standing quiet, brushing her fingers against the cold stone and whispering, "I would have fed him," the ache in his chest eased. Loss did not fade, but it no longer swallowed him whole. Her presence did not erase his past, it gave it a place to rest. It was during one of those visits that she turned to him, her eyes dark and steady. "Do they rest easy now?" she asked. Gideon nodded, his voice rough. "I think they would have liked you." She did not smile, but the softness in her gaze told him that she understood. That night when she combed her hair by the hearth with the small comb he had given her, Gideon watched, the firelight casting her in warm tones. She caught his gaze, did not look away. And for the first time since Micah's death, Gideon felt as though his house no longer stood only as a monument to what he had lost, but as a place where something new had taken root. The days unfolded in that rhythm, chores, meals, silences full of meaning. Yet beneath it all, a truth pressed steady against them both. What had begun in survival had turned into something chosen, something whole. Gideon felt it when she lingered closer at night, when her lips touched his cheek and later his mouth, not in haste, not in demand, but slow and deliberate. He had not thought himself capable of such closeness again, not without betraying the memory of his wife and son. But standing there with Tiva, feeling her hand rest lightly on his chest, he knew it was not betrayal. It was renewal. They made love for the first time in the hayloft, the sound of horses breathing steady below, the rafters creaking in the wind. There was no rush, no hunger that sought to take. Gideon touched her as though she were not broken, as though she had never been bound, and she held him as though she did not need to fight anymore. When it was done, they lay side by side, her head on his chest, his hand brushing through her hair. The snow outside had begun to fall again, light and silent, but inside the loft, warmth spread like the fire of spring itself. From that night, the cot in the cabin stood empty. Tiva no longer curled alone by the hearth. She lay with Gideon beneath the quilts, their breaths mingling in the dark, their silences no longer separate but shared. Her boots sat beside his by the door. Her shawl hung beside his coat. The cabin, once a hollow refuge for a man half dead with grief, now carried life. It was no longer his alone. It was theirs. The town of Lobo Crossing whispered, as towns do, about the rancher who had taken in a wild girl. Some said he had lost his mind, some that she had bewitched him. But neither Gideon nor Tiva cared. The valley was theirs, the ridge their witness, the cabin their sanctuary. And in that place they carried a truth no whisper could undo. She had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let her. As spring deepened, so did their bond. Gideon no longer rose each morning only for the chores. He rose for the sight of her braid falling loose across her shoulder, for the sound of her voice practicing words by the fire, for the quiet certainty that he no longer lived beside graves alone. And Tiva no longer watched the door with measuring eyes. She no longer memorized trails for escape. She lived as though she belonged because she did. And so, in the thaw of that valley, among graves and whispered judgments, Gideon, Cain, and Tiva built a truth stronger than grief and louder than silence, the truth of presence, of choice, of staying. By late March, the valley had shed the last of winter's hold. Snowmelt cut streams through the pasture. The cottonwoods along the ridge budded pale green, and the air carried the smell of wet earth instead of frost. Gideon Cain had lived long enough to know the frontier was never gentle for long, but this season came with a mercy he had not tasted in years. The cabin no longer stood as a monument to grief. It had become something else entirely. Alive with the sound of footsteps not his own, the low hum of chores shared, and the steady warmth of a woman who had chosen to stay. Tiva moved through the rooms without hesitation now, her shawl hanging beside his coat, her boots beside his at the door. She was no longer guest, no longer shadow. She was partner. And in that truth, Gideon felt something rise in him that he had thought buried forever. Hope. The whispers in town grew louder as word carried. Some said he had taken in a savage, others that she had bewitched him. A few claimed pity, that he had gone mad from grief. Gideon heard none of it directly. No one dared say it to his face. And even if they had, it would not have mattered. He had buried the only voices that had ever held weight with him on the ridge 5 winters ago. What he had now was not for the town to name. It was his and hers, and no man could touch it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air smelled of thawing earth, Tiva laid her hand on her stomach, her eyes distant. She was late, she told him, voice quiet but certain. Gideon stood still, the weight of her words pressing into him like stone. He searched her face, not for proof, but for fear. There was none, only calm. "Do you want this?" he asked, his voice low. She held his gaze and nodded, "Yes. I did not know if I could, not after what was done to me. But now, yes." Gideon exhaled, slow, steady. He stepped closer, placed his rough hand over hers, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to picture a future instead of a past. That night he could not sleep. He lay awake beside her, his hand resting on her waist, listening to the rise and fall of her breath. He thought of Micah, of the grave dug with frozen hands, of the silence that had followed. He thought of Tiva, of her defiance in the stock pen, of her choice to return to the fire instead of running. He thought of what might grow now, of a life not bound by grief but by choice. And as he listened to her breathing, he knew with certainty this child, if it came, would not be born into silence. It would be born into presence. The thaw quickened. Water ran in the creek, birdsong filled the mornings, and the valley stretched wide in green. Gideon and Tiva worked side by side to prepare for what lay ahead. She sewed dresses from dark blue calico, her stitches clean and sure. He mended fences, patched the barn roof, and began clearing ground for a garden. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, the dog sprawled at their feet, the air soft with pine and damp soil. She leaned against him, her head beneath his jaw, his arm around her shoulders. "I never thought I would have this," she whispered once. Gideon looked out at the ridge, the cottonwood budding above 2 graves. "It wasn't taken from you," he said. "You held on." She turned her face up to his, her eyes steady. "You didn't fix me," she said. "I didn't try." He answered. "That's why I healed." The days stretched longer, the air warmer. One afternoon, Tiva stood by the porch, the sun catching her braid, the swell of her belly just beginning to show beneath her dress. Gideon paused from his work, hammer in hand, and watched. She caught his gaze, smiled faintly. And for the first time in years, Gideon felt the ache in his chest lift. He no longer lived beside graves alone. He lived beside life. It was then, under the soft light of evening, that she asked him if he would marry her. The words were quiet, but they struck with force. Gideon's hand stilled on the table. "Yes," he said, his voice low, "but only if you carry my name, because it is yours now, not because I saved you." She looked at him long and steady. "You didn't save me," she said. "You saw me." That is more. He rose, went to the chest, and pulled out a silver ring that had belonged to his mother. He did not kneel, did not speak vows. He simply held it out. She slipped it on her finger. It fit, and with that, without ceremony, without witnesses, they were bound, not by law alone, but by choice. That night, as they lay beneath the quilts, their hands linked over her stomach, they spoke of names for the child. If it was a boy, it would not bear Micah's name. "This one gets his own," Gideon said. If it was a girl, they would choose together. Tiva smiled into the dark, content. Gideon closed his eyes, listening to the wind press against the shutters. The sound no longer a reminder of loneliness, but of life carried within these walls. And so the cabin that had once stood as a grave now stood as a home. The man who had once lived only in silence now shared it with a woman who had refused to kneel. Together they had built something out of loss, something steady, something whole. Their scars remains, their grief did not vanish, but they had chosen to stay, and in that choice they had found family. The ridge above still held 2 stones, but below it the house breathed differently. The air was filled with bread baking, laughter breaking through now and again, and the quiet certainty of 2 souls who had chosen each other against every cruelty the world had offered. And in that choice, Gideon, Cain, and Tiva built not just survival, but life